Welcome to Now We're Getting Somewhere. I'm Katie, and I'm a certified life coach, but I've also been a management consultant at McKinsey and a product manager at a tech startup. In other words, I know what it feels like to have a life that looks pretty good on paper, but doesn't feel as good as I want it to. I help my professional clients develop lives that are more meaningful, happy, and also more successful. And I want to share the same practical insights with you. Let's go. Hey everybody, welcome to episode 14 of Now We're Getting Somewhere. Today I wanted to share my client Olivia's story. I'm not going to give you an overview of Olivia yet because we'll get into all of that in this honestly really amazing interview. But Olivia is just so smart and so thoughtful and really funny. And she has basically the best chemistry metaphors to describe personal growth that I have ever heard in my life. Honestly, it's worth it to listen to this episode for the chemistry metaphors alone, but she also talks about her skepticism of me and life coaching more generally, how she overcame the desire to be liked, how she completely redefined what being a rock star at work meant to her and actually took quite different action based on that change in identity, how she learned to be someone who could trust her gut after being much more cognitively led for most of her life, and just so much more. I can feel myself wanting to say more, but I'm not, because you're going to hear it soon enough. Here is my interview with Olivia. Hello, Olivia.
Hello.
Thank you for being on the podcast today.
Of course.
I love to start these interviews by just giving you a chance to introduce yourself to the people. Like, what should people know about you?
Sure. So I would describe myself as an engineer currently on a self-declared, self-funded sabbatical.
We'll talk more about that. Yeah.
And loving it. And I think we'll get into more details about how I got here. But I identify as an engineer. It's what I've been primarily working on for the last 6 years or so. And so that's where I started, and that's how I met you.
Cool. Love it. Well, I want to talk for most of our time just talking about all the great insights that you have that I think are going to be useful for people. But I like to start out by saying, like, let's talk about the before. So before we started working together, how were you feeling? Where were you at in your life? What made you think like coaching might be useful to me?
I was totally stuck before I met you. And I was stuck in this pattern of burnout where I was, running on the hamster wheel and terrified to get off, but I was just so tired. And if that hamster wheel slowed down or stopped for too long. And I wasn't stuck for lack of trying either, because in many ways, I was also very frustrated with myself that I was so stuck. I would identify as someone who has been highly organized, planned, methodical, analytical, very deliberate about many of my decisions, going back to definitely at least high school, where I was always thinking about the next 4 years. I was comfortable playing the long game. I was comfortable thinking about what do I want to do now, so that way I've achieved my goals 4 years from now. I think this really became amplified in college. Because college was an environment where I got as much out of it as I put in. And so, not to shame either perspective, but, freshman year, day 2, I was in the industry department liaison's office with a fully completed draft of a resume. While my roommates are swapping stories about blacking out during orientation. So obviously not saying either camp is good or one way or the other, but like just to give you an idea of like what my goals were and how intentional and focused and driven I was about meeting those goals, especially when I started college. And I was also someone who was very comfortable navigating and finding my leverage in a highly structured system. And what I mean by that is I was super comfortable with bureaucracy. I was not scared of it. I started as an engineering student in a very rigid curriculum, and college was where my pattern of burnout also began to start.
Mm.
So I had a rock star freshman year. I was acing my classes, stepping outside of my comfort zone, meeting lots of people. And then I was also overcommitting myself to way too much. And something that was really missing the whole time, but I just never addressed in college, was that I didn't really have a North Star for what I wanted. And what I mean by that is I was looking to others all the time to kind of figure out, what do I want and what would I consider a success. So I was constantly looking to the upperclassmen who, looked the happiest, the most successful, who seemed to have the most prestige. And I thought, okay, I want to be them. How am I going to be them in 4 years? And this was already starting to come into conflict with what I enjoyed doing and what I wanted to spend my time exploring. Because junior year of college was when I started to just feel really disillusioned. Because I took so many of my cues for inspiration from others, I was also really impacted by some truly crappy professors who did not care. And I thought, I don't enjoy this major anymore, but I'm not sure what else I would be interested in studying. And, I almost changed majors, and my guidance counselor at the time was like, Olivia, you have a high GPA, you've had multiple internships, your resume looks great. If you do this, you're going to delay graduation by another year. She's like, I think you should just stick it out, get through graduation, and if you really feel that strongly about doing something differently, then just get a master's. That was the advice that I had gotten.
Wow.
And I was really frustrated with the advice to basically be like, just power through the status quo. And so this was my response at the time in terms of how to address my college burnout, where I really took the school's red tape and just slapped them in the face with it. Because my school has a policy called petitions, where if you want to do something different from the prescribed curriculum that you have to complete for graduation, you can submit a petition. And what this means is, like, you identify what deviation do you want to pursue, you write an essay, it needs to be approved by like your guidance counselor, by the department head, and things like that. So most people only do that once in 4 years. And most of my classmates were doing that to get out of, pre-med requirements, because they were like, I don't want to go into medical school. I don't want to take this random biology class. And so, that was what most people use that process for. And in the span of 1 year, I submitted 11.
Whoa!
After the first 3, all 8 got approved, which in my opinion was 100% success rate, because those first 3 were just a learning curve where I was just trying to figure out the system. And I submitted 11, 8 of which got approved. So that way, I could take more flexible classes that appealed to my interests, but still furthered my engineering education. And so that was an example of how I decided to learn a system and identify what tools I had at hand and how I could use that to leverage my personal goals. And so I had tried doing this at my company as well. But this worked at school, and, I graduated a happy engineer with job offer in hand, and it did not work. Well, it worked in my company, but it did not achieve the outcome that I had hoped for, because I worked for a very large corporation where it would have been very easy to feel like I was working for different companies on the role or team that I was in. And so my first role, I thought, maybe it's just that I'm not interested in the technical subject matter. And so my company has a somewhat infamously opaque career advancement and performance ranking system. But, I started identifying, okay, who are my allies? Who is willing to help champion me? who is someone who is willing to extend a helping hand. And I started building relationships, and I transferred to a new role in a completely different part of the company. And that still was not the answer, whereas the first 3 years of my time in that corporation, I would say the predominant emotion I was feeling was anger.
Mm-hmm.
And now in this new role, I was just constantly tired. So this second role was involved in manufacturing, whereas the first role was in software. And those are two very different worlds. And the second role, I liked my team, but I was just exhausted from being on call all the time. And I knew that my own working habits were also contributing, because I thought I had enough self-awareness to know that this is a pattern of burnout that I'm engaging in. I've changed my environment, but, a leopard doesn't change its spots, or maybe I forget what the right phrase is, but
That's pretty much it. Yeah.
But I was putting myself in new environments, but finding that I was continuing to burn myself out, and that the tools and strategies that I had learned from others, from family, from friends, from school, they weren't working. And so I was just so stuck and so exhausted. And that was my state of mind when I found you.
I love this journey that you just took us on, Olivia, because I think it just shows what a striking person you are. And that not only are you somebody who is very smart, very high achieving, very able to be successful academically or professionally, and you know how to work the system, and you did that in college and in your professional life. But then you're also somebody who goes beyond that. You would ideally like to bend the system to what will work for you. And you've actually successfully you did that in college. And I know, and you did that to a certain degree at your corporation where you were successful, you made alliances, you had people who really were rooting for you, but nonetheless, despite all that kind of skillfulness that you had, you still were feeling really burnt out, and you couldn't make the system work for you with what you had in hand.
Right. And, when someone is unhappy, people close to you obviously want to provide advice. And so a lot of the advice that I was getting from very well-meaning family and friends was mostly in two camps. It was either one, be grateful for what you have, or it was, you just need to be disciplined, because if you wanted this change enough, you would carve out the time to quit, or to find a new job and to quit and to do something different. You just have to make that time to study for the GMAT or to apply for new jobs. And addressing the first camp, I recognized that part of the problem was me. And so that was part of the equation in terms of why I went to you, because I knew that I needed more help in figuring out and unpacking what are my habits and thoughts that are contributing to my burnout. Before the second camp, I was bone deep exhausted, because there were days where I would commute back from work, and sometimes that commute would take up to an hour and a half after a 12-hour workday. And I would come back so tired, and it's a bit of a running joke that my apartment does not have any soft seating. So I'm just lying down on my hard wooden IKEA bench. And I know that I need to eat dinner, I need to shower, I need to pack, I need to produce my to-do list for tomorrow. But I was just so tired, I didn't want to get up from that bench. And I knew that the longer I stayed on that bench, the more tired I was going to be tomorrow, because I would now go to bed even later, all those tasks. And the thought of even just lying in bed first never came to me, because I was like, well, if I do that, then I won't have done everything else that I think I need to succeed for tomorrow. And so it was just this horrible cycle of being really exhausted and feeling very isolated in that exhaustion.
Yeah. Oh, that lands in my body. What an evocative image of you on that bench. Yeah. I think a lot of people are going to resonate with that, in terms of like, yeah, we are exhausted from our jobs. And you haven't mentioned this, but like, you were fairly impressive professionally. And so it wasn't like, it like looked good from the outside. You had what a lot of people would have wanted.
Right. I passed for high functioning, which was why it was even more challenging to kind of justify to myself as well about why I was struggling so hard to identify the changes that I needed to make.
Right. You're this resourceful person who's not incapable of knowing herself, who does have self-awareness, who thinks about a lot of things, but why can't you figure out this next? I think that's great. Yeah, that's such a great description. That lands with me. Well, can you tell me, like, you sort of spoken to it, but like, what were your expectations about coaching? How did you think it was going to fit in? How did you think it was going to go?
So the reason why I started to consider coaching was I actually don't know that I told you this, but it was actually because I found an Instagram post from your account. So part of the reason why I hesitated so much in just carving that time out to apply for a new job was that I knew in my gut that if I just applied for a new job and got it, that I would just burn myself out again. Because I hadn't really addressed what do I need to recover and what do I actually want. And you had on Instagram this graphic of like, millennial burns out at job, quits job, goes on a grand gesture to like travel the world, runs out of money, doesn't make any changes, finds a new job and repeats, rinse and repeat. And I thought, okay, this is exactly my greatest fear. And that's what first caught my attention. And because you were a life coach and had a free newsletter, that's when I subscribed and started following your content. And that's how I first got interested in coaching. It felt like a large investment to make at first, which is why I didn't initially, immediately sign up for life coaching.
Yeah.
But what you had to say and what you were sharing publicly really resonated with me. And so I started following the content that you were putting out. And when you announced, at the time you had something called Dessert Club, which was like a shortened version of life coaching specifically around food. Mm-hmm. And when you first announced that, I thought, okay, it's a lower investment. I can kind of sample and try this out and see, okay, would I actually be interested in a longer term working relationship with you? And so that's how I first got interested in life coaching. That's how I kind of, dipped my foot into that pool. And I got so much out of those 3 months, even though it was about food. A lot of it does relate to just foundational beliefs that I have about my life, what's impacting me, what I'm feeling. And so after those 3 months, I was like, okay, I love how free I feel around food. I didn't realize that I could feel this good around food. It also was probably good because it also introduced a lot of the early exercises that you introduced, like listening to your body, 10 minutes of doing nothing, journaling every day. None of those were habits that I had before finding you. And I had tried all of them to an extent before finding you. And I was an early skeptic. I will admit that.
Yeah.
But Dessert Club was an opportunity for me to kind of work through that skepticism and really give things a try. I'm always all in when I try something. And so I was all in for those 3 months. And I thought, wow, this was such a big difference. And it's very clear that the smoking gun in my life is my relationship to work. And I think it's worth investing in that.
Oh, I love how you describe that. I just want to like underline what you said to make sure the people have heard, which is like, even if you hear Olivia talking about stuff like being aware of your body or like journaling and you're like, oh, I hate that. I would never do that. And like, I'm not going to make you do anything, but also it might be different than you think. I'll just say,
Yeah. And I think I will also acknowledge that even after those 3 months, I hadn't fully adopted any of those habits either.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
I hadn't fully bought in yet, but I had experienced so much positive change that I thought, what Katie is sharing, is working for me. And I very much subscribe to that analogy of, the way we learn about the atom in chemistry, where there's so many different historical models of the atom that have been developed over the centuries. And, each one was shaped by the biases and beliefs and limitations of that time period. But we'll learn about each one of them because each one of them is better at explaining a certain concept. And so holistically, it's valuable to learn about each model of the atom to kind of complete a more comprehensive understanding of chemistry. And so that's what I also try to apply outside of, chemistry class, because I thought, okay, I don't have to agree or buy into or believe everything that Katie shares with me, but there's bound to be value from different things that she shares with me. And the fact that I've gotten this much value out of 3 months with Katie, even though at the time I hated meditation, I didn't get journaling, nothing, did not make sense to me. Like, if I had 10 minutes of free time, why would I spend it doing nothing? But at that point, I had already kind of started to see some value out of having done some of those exercises.
Yeah.
And I had gotten so much out of it. So I thought, okay, this already exceeded my expectations for how much change and improvement I could have expected in my quality of life. So that's why, even though I was still a little bit on the fence about some of the exercises we had been doing, I thought, this is worth it.
Yeah, I love that description. Well, can I also say, I think you'll probably remember this too. It was either in our initial one-on-one coaching consultation or one of our first sessions, you said to me something along the lines of like, are we just going to like chat? I just want to make sure like we're going to do things in this session.
I was going to bring that up too, because, tying back to the way I'd always operated, like I was so used to having that 4-year outlook and being able to map out exactly what I was going to do at different checkpoints to reach that 4-year goal. And here was this abstract idea of life coaching where, there is no objective that can be promised because those objectives are the ones that I determined for myself. And I had such difficulty picturing, where will I be 6 months from now or 12 months from now when I start life coaching. And I also had never gone to therapy. I know therapy is different from life coaching, but I also had never had experience with therapy. So this would have been my first time in a one-on-one coaching environment. And yeah, I had great difficulty, picturing what are we going to do, and how can I make sure that this will all add up to a measure of success at the end. So I remember saying that to you, I remember blurting that out at the very end of our initial consultation because we had a great conversation. I was like, okay, great. I'll sign the commitment. And then again, I was like, Katie, what if we just spent 6 months and all that happens is we become friends? I don't remember what you said to me in that moment, but I do remember the 3 big takeaways that I had after that call that solidified my commitment to life coaching. And the first was just this deep conviction that I have tried everything that I so far and that I was not satisfied with the trajectory and future that I was seeing if I were to maintain the status quo. So that remained true, regardless of any skepticism or hesitation I had about life coaching. The second was that, if anything, engineering has taught me that there are a lot of decisions we have to make without having all available data. But it's possible that life coaching will be useful in ways that I don't yet know how to measure. All that this is what I need, and I just do not have ways to measure that because I don't yet have the tools developed. And the third thing I thought was, this is a risk. There is some unknown. But I thought, of all the people to take a bet on myself, I should be the first person to bet on me. And so those three thoughts were why I was still comfortable moving forward with life coaching, even though I had a really hard time picturing the, quote unquote, progress or quantifiable progress that I was going to see.
Yeah, I'm so glad you shared those thoughts because I think they could be useful for people. And I'm also really grateful for you to just be like, yeah, I also had skepticism. And I was like, it felt like this black box that I couldn't quite conceive of or put my arms around, because I think a lot of people feel that way too. I think that's a thing that's very common as people are considering coaching.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's flesh out, once we open the black box, what it was like. So we did start working together. Can you remember, we were emailing a bit about it, but can you remember some of like the first things that we talked about that were like new insights or new ways of looking at things or acting in the world for you?
Yeah, I think what is also important to call out is that I timed the start of our life coaching with the start of a 6-week vacation from work.
Yeah.
I had accumulated 6 weeks of vacation, which within the American work system should also say a lot. And so I took those 6 weeks, and I remember saying to you, Katie, that I had two primary concerns. Like the two biggest questions I had was, one, how do I break this pattern of continuously burning myself out? And how do I figure out what I'm interested in next? But because I had just started this 6 weeks of vacation, which was so foreign, I should say, to all of my colleagues and supervisors, everyone was expecting me to make a grand gesture out of this. Like half of the people thought that I was going to take off across the ocean and just, backpack for 6 weeks. And the other half thought that I was going to quit my company, because no one took more than 2 weeks of vacation unless you were a high-level executive or someone close to retirement, or you were planning to quit. And so I was feeling a lot of pressure, and I was operating from a mindset of scarcity, where I remember telling you, Katie, I was like, okay, my definition of success is that by the end of this 6 weeks, I will have figured out what I want to do next. Like, I'm not going to be unreasonable. Like, I'm not going to say I have to have a job lined up, but I want to know what I'm going to do next. And I think it was great that you met me where I was at. You recognized, you listened and recognized that I was not in a position yet to really immediately see that those were not necessarily the right questions or goals to be at. But you said, okay. You took it in stride. You said, if that's what you truly want, I will work with you on figuring out what job you want to do next. And you asked all the right questions. And I thought, shit, like this all comes back to me having no idea what I want to do next because I'm just too burnt out. So I think my first big learning was accepting the place that deep rest needs in my life. And accepting that recovery also happens on a nonlinear timeline. I really resonated with your analogy of energy buckets in relation to an energy management system. And it took the first 4 weeks of my vacation to really recognize that, oh, okay, I will not recover from burnout just because I say I want to, or just because I've given myself a certain amount of time. It's taken me years to get to this point. It's not like I can flip a switch and say, all right, week 1, done with burnout. Week 2, research jobs. So I had to kind of break out of that very prescriptive timeline that I had set for myself to meet the arbitrary goal of impressing colleagues, by the end of my 6 weeks. And it took me 4 weeks to kind of get to that point. It took me to really relax into that time that I had given myself. And the last 2 weeks were amazing. Like, I was feeling refreshed. I was feeling recovered. And I remember shocking everyone by returning to work. All of my supervisors and colleagues had expected me to quit. But even those first 6 weeks with you, I had learned that I needed to accept deep rest. And just in that first lesson alone, I was able to kind of reframe the way I'd been thinking about returning to work at my company. Because I thought, they're willing to accommodate me a second time to try a completely different team environments, completely different job.
And obviously you had timed your break so that you were finishing up one role and you were going to transition to a totally different role. So that's what you're speaking to.
Yeah, that was also the case I had made to kind of make my 6-week break socially acceptable within my workplace, because I thought, we talk about not letting our vacation expire, but we have some really big commitments to deliver near the end of my time in this role. I said it makes the most sense to have my gap between my old role and my new role be this time that I take all my vacation. And so, yes, originally I had been thinking about, do I accept this new opportunity that my company is giving me, or do I quit and find a new role? Because I had been talking about quitting this company for 5 years.
Yeah.
So to return to the company initially felt like being a sellout, almost like, oh, okay, like they could buy me with just 6 weeks of vacation.
Mm.
And it was after that deep rest where I realized, oh, okay, I was just so burnt out. I just needed that extended time for rest. And I was able to realize in that time that, I've developed a strong rapport, reputation. I like my coworkers. I like my friends. This is a new opportunity that if I were to take outside of this company would likely come with a relocation and pay cut and basically starting over from scratch in a new company. And so I thought, let's take advantage of what I've built over the last 5 years to explore this new opportunity. And yeah, I came back ready to work, which I would not have expected at the start of those first 6 weeks.
Yeah, you finally did some of that deep rest and you were ready to work. And my memory of it too, and you correct me, was also that you had decided that you didn't know what you wanted to do, but you wanted to practice getting the hours down at work and seeing what sort of rest was possible, even in your current role, as you kind of figured out what was next. Is that your memory of how it felt at the time?
Right. It wasn't that this new opportunity that my company was offering me was, my dream job or anything like that. It was more that I realized it was a new opportunity that would give me another powerful set of skills and experiences. And it was also an opportunity for me to really experiment and learn how to effectively spend my energy at work, so that way I could build a more sustainable model of working, so that when there was a better opportunity, I would be able to go into that opportunity confident that I wasn't just going to immediately burn myself out.
Yep. I love that. Well, that's such a great description. So so you're back at work, you're trying out this new role, you're doing some work to be intentional about your work habits so that you don't have to burn yourself out again in terms of your work habits. You're trying to think about what you want next. Take me through what was another big thing at this sort of time that you remember noticing coming out of the coaching?
The other biggest takeaway I had from coaching was accepting that it was okay to sometimes feel disliked or misunderstood. And really, if I think back on it, my entire life, almost all of my anxiety ties back to this fear of being misunderstood or being disliked. And this felt so big to me because so much of my sense of self and sense of self-confidence, sense of self-worth were all tied to my work reputation and my work performance. And so it felt really scary to consider a situation where my supervisor wasn't happy with me or a coworker didn't like me, because that challenged more fundamental beliefs I had about my self-worth and self-confidence, because all of my identity was tied with work. And that was part of the reason why it was also so difficult for me to consider leaving the company, even though I wanted to, because, lots of friends have interrogated, like, well, why are you staying at this company for so long? Like, why haven't you quit? Is it the pay? And it's like, genuinely, I could answer, no, it's not that they offer really high pay. And it's genuinely because work was the environment where I learned how to become confident. And I was letting that go. And to kind of maintain that kind of pristine image at work, I was constantly anticipating worst case scenarios out of interactions that I had with supervisors. And that contributed to a lot of anxiety spirals. And so that was one of the first big things we had to work on when I returned to work, because it was all of this anxiety around work performance that was really contributing to a lot of my burnout. I think XYZ colleague really doesn't like me. And this is the only person I get to interact with as part of my team, and I was expending so much energy towards thinking about it, not in a very productive way, but just spiraling about it. And because I was emotionally investing so much energy into that, work therefore took up far more of my energy, both when I was at work and outside of work. So I think one of the first biggest lessons you taught me was this 95% concept, which I still refer back to. And you were like, Olivia, even if you spent 100% of all of your efforts and you were 100% successful in your execution of everything you tried, do you think that everyone in the world will still like you? And it was like, no, like, obviously, intellectually, I knew that there will always be people who may dislike me, who I will dislike. And to put it in those terms really helped me understand that it was not, I needed to be wiser about how I spent my energy, and I needed to be more aware of how deeply my need for validation from everyone I met was also unsustainable.
Yeah, I love that one. And just to make sure I've explained that too, it's like the 95% thing is like, even if you're like, you do everything to be likable, 5% of people, just because they don't like your face or whatever, you remind them of their annoying cousin, aren't going to like you. Like, no matter what you do, and if you do a different set of actions to make those people like you, some other 5% won't like you. It's not winnable to 100% accuracy. You're always going to have to deal with that 5% no matter what. So you might as well just accept it.
Right. And this tied into more helpful, concrete habits to implement at work, because then I became much more comfortable about ruthlessly prioritizing my time at work. And I remember using the word ruthless with you a lot.
Yeah, I got so fired up. They can't see my face, but I love it when you say ruthless.
Yeah. That was where I had to really reconcile and reckon with how many hours my job truly deserved and what was still be a rock star performer and contribute, because I had been working unsustainable hours as a result of unsustainable anxiety, for validation. And that was where I really learned, okay, even if my goal was to be a rock star employee at this company, a rock star employee would still be someone who ruthlessly prioritizes what needs to get done every single day or week or month. And in order to do so, she also has to ruthlessly prioritize how many hours is she going to spend at work. I remember having to kind of write down this mantra, a rock star employee is someone who also ruthlessly moderates her hours.
Yeah. Well, I just want to like make sure I'm highlighting this with like bright pink highlighter as you're saying this for like all the people to listen. Cause like, this is like genuine identity work. Like, you didn't have this thought initially. Like, we workshopped this to be like, okay, but you want to be like a rock star? Like, do rock stars like modulate their hours? Do rock stars like ruthlessly like, and I wasn't like, oh, I told you that. It was like, you really developed that on your own as a result of our time together. But like, you created this identity of like, this is what a rock star does. A rock star modulates her hours so she can be fresh when she comes back tomorrow. A rock star, as a result, is going to ruthlessly prioritize. So she's focused with her best brain power on the most important things. And when you created that, look what opened up for you. Like it's like, I feel like people listening to it feels like, yeah, of course, good idea. But like actually stepping into that as your identity is like, it's a real piece of personal development that you did.
Right, because I had been receiving so much external validation at work when I was putting in all those excess hours, when I was putting in all that extra effort to constantly try to anticipate additional needs. And so it was scary to kind of let go of that idea and try something that felt like it would cause the opposite results. But if anything, I got even more positive external validation at work, where I got more respect for my competency, for my assertiveness, and for my authority and leadership that I previously had when I, didn't subscribe to that way of thinking, but now it was coming with less effort.
Yeah, well, and let's be really clear. I mean, I think what you said was so well said, but it's like there were literally instances where you would ruthlessly prioritize, push back, refuse to do things, speak up to your managers in like very clear and confident ways about what you and your colleagues would be doing and not doing. And people really responded to it. They were like, "You're a leader, Olivia."
Yeah, something I hadn't anticipated was that they really respected that, because then it also meant that they could trust me to work in a more sustainable manner that still delivered results. This is not to say that I had, the most supportive culture or the best supervisors.
You did not.
Even
yeah, I'll say that.
But even from the culture and the supervisors I was working with, people across, the spectrum of, good to bad supervisors were responding to that new way of working that I was introducing.
And I will say, and we're not going to talk about exactly where you worked, but it was like an organization that's like a very typical corporation in that like a lot of people were overworking. It wasn't a culture where people were like, we work the minimum hours. It's all about lifestyle kind of place.
Yeah, my workplace was high pressure, high demand. I think the best way to describe it is probably my initial impression when I first started, because it's very easy to clue into a company culture when you first start. Like your gut instantly tells you. And I remember having called an upperclassman before accepting this offer, where I said, I've heard some issues about this place's culture. Like, what's your take on it? You started with them. What's your experience? And he said, everyone is willing to help and be friendly. It's just that everyone is extremely type A. And originally I thought, sure, like I'm type A, I should be fine. And I start and I'm like, no, everyone is type triple A. Everyone is batshit crazy. That's literally, those are verbatim the words I said to everyone in my first 2 weeks of work. I'm like, everyone is batshit crazy. Everyone is emailing like their pants are on fire. And that was just the accepted norm. For the way that this workplace promoted working.
Yeah. So you were there like defining for yourself. I mean, internally, you weren't like announcing that to everyone, but sort of defining for yourself what your goals were to both be a rock star and that a rock star would do these things to make sustainable that would be best for her and for the organization, and like getting positive feedback for it.
Yeah. I remember another team lead telling me in a one-on-one, she was like, after I saw you did that, I did that too. And it turned out great. I was like, great. I'm not trying to introduce a movement. I'm just trying to work in a more sustainable manner.
But you became this example for what's possible. Yeah, it wasn't, I mean, you weren't trying to be like the Messiah that brings good work habits to the people, but like, it's like, yeah, we become this example and then people see what's possible from watching us.
And so I think that was the second biggest takeaway I got from coaching. The first lesson was deep rest. And the second was learning to challenge and redefine my relationship to work and recognizing who are my friends, who are my allies, who are my colleagues, and who are my supervisors. Because all of them, because there are different healthy and reasonable things for each of those sets of groups for me to give to and for me to expect from. That was a very weirdly stated sentence. What I'm trying to say is that what I learned was, okay, just because someone is a work colleague doesn't necessarily mean that they deserve me the same amount of energy that I might give to a friend. Or because someone's a supervisor doesn't mean that I need to give them the same energy that I might expect from a friend or things like that. And reworking that relationship fundamentally changed the way the hours I work, where I worked, how fast I worked, how fast I learned, what I was comfortable asking for others from, how to take feedback, what feedback to absorb and what feedback to deflect. And fundamentally, this changed the way I thought about what work deserves to get out of me and what I deserve to get out of work.
Yeah, I love listening to you. This is so great. Okay, I love it. And I love all the like subtle threads in it too, of like, because I just think it's like we can listen to someone who's had a journey like yours and be like, yeah, I know all those things. But like, it's really subtle on the journey. Like you didn't realize, for example, how much your thoughts about wanting other people to think positive thoughts about you were burning you out, and how that was in turn affecting your actions. And like, there's just all these subtle threads that you don't realize are affecting you until you really like start digging and sort through all the muck in there.
Right. Kara Lowenthal also had a pretty good quote. I can't remember it word for word, but it was something like, a thought is not a belief if it's something that falls apart when it's challenged. So, I already believed early on that, it's important to work a reasonable number of hours, that it's important to not let work define who I am. But it was very different actually putting it into practice and allowing that belief to be weathered or challenged by a lot of external influences.
Yeah. I love all parts of that, because yes, it's one thing to believe that in theory. And I bet most people believe that, but it's another to actually have your work day reflect that belief. And that takes a lot of subtle nuance. And it takes a lot of like, we worked through a lot of your fears and thoughts over time, and like, how can you be with all of those, and how can you believe something new so that you could actually implement this?
Right. I think the other big takeaway that I took from coaching was that change takes time. It takes time for a person to change, and you have to be willing to give yourself more time than potentially you planned for. Because I think it ties to my recovery from burnout. Like, just because I've given myself 6 weeks to recover from burnout doesn't mean that 6 weeks is all I need. But it was the start of me beginning to better listen to myself and better understand and accept my state of mind and the continuous work in progress that I needed to pursue.
I love this interview. Okay, so tell us, what else should we know about like what your insights were and where you were in terms of your journey?
I think that's a pretty good summary of the first 9 months that we worked together, where, at the end of 9 months, I had accepted and learned to value deep rest. I had found and implemented foundational habits of learning to be more curious and compassionate about my thoughts and feelings, so that way I could better self-soothe all of the anxiety spirals that were initially extremely disruptive to my daily life. And I also had learned to start reframing the way I thought about work and how to more sustainably put in energy at work. And so all of these, I thought, were lessons that I think would have been very difficult or would have taken me many years to have really figured out on my own.
Yeah. I love that way of phrasing it, because you're also an incredibly resourceful person. It's not like you could have never figured this out, but it's hard on your own. It might have taken longer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is also a pretty good transition to talk about why I ultimately chose to leave, because I did start my introduction by saying that I'm on a self-funded, self-declared sabbatical, which is another thing that I'm unemployed by choice. And I was starting in that new opportunity after that 6-week vacation. And I had reclaimed my weekends, reclaimed my weeknights. I was able to take advantage of the slower pace that was inherent to this new opportunity, to work with you on kind of challenging the old ways I'd been working. And then I got hit by a wrecking ball, I want to say around 9 months into our time working together, where we had an extremely large deliverable due with several stacked deadlines. And it was a little bit like I was the last domino to fall out of hundreds of dominoes over several months, where I was stuck between a rock and a hard place when it came to my deadlines and the amount of time that I was being given to deliver. And this was also very difficult because I had also just become extremely sick. This was definitely the sickest I'd been in my life. I was not able to say a sentence without coughing. I was waking up at 2 a.m. to start coughing until my 7 a.m. morning meetings. And I was still working. I was working consecutive weeks, consecutive weekends, after months of already consecutive weekends. And there was a point where I got to the day before a big presentation, and I was still sick. And I worked 19 consecutive hours on a PowerPoint that truly, in my opinion, delivered no value. But, that was definitely a wake-up call where I was able to take a step back and I was like, okay, wow, is this deteriorating quality of life worth any future that I see with this company? And that answer was no. I was always thinking about the long game, and I always knew that I was never going to retire from this company, which was very common at this workplace.
People staying there their whole careers and then retiring. Yeah.
One holiday season, I gave someone a random Christmas card because that's what I do over the holidays. I like to give little thank you notes. And that was enough basis for this person to invite me to their 30-year anniversary anniversary party. But, the 30-year anniversaries were a dime a dozen at this company. And I always knew that I was never going to be one of those people, but I just had never had the momentum to actually leave. And this was where, because of all the coaching we had done about my need for deep rest, my need for deep focus and deep time and recovery to figure out what I'm interested in next, my need to reframe the way I worked, that was where the most critical shift in my thinking happened. Because before I was always thinking, well, what if whatever I do next is worse than what I have now? And that changed to, it is worse for me to stay in my current role and I need something new. And I'm ready to find that new opportunity. I like to say that I reached the activation energy that was necessary for.
I love all the science metaphors. Love them.
And so this chemical reaction had been in the works for a long time. All the right catalysts were in place. All the right reactants were in place. And I just did not yet have the activation energy to really allow that reaction to progress to its conclusion. And so that day vividly, I remember this is my activation energy. And so that led to the very difficult process of making the decision to leave the company and follow through on that decision. That was definitely one of the most difficult decisions I've ever had to carry through on. And it's also one of the decisions I'm most proud of too.
Oh, I'm like, this must be for you. Well, and let's be clear, a big part of it, and you can correct me, it was also that for you leaving a good job without another job lined up felt really hard. Like that felt like you had a lot of thoughts about what that meant and a lot of beliefs, and there was a lot of social pressure. So that was a big part of it.
Yeah, I think it would have been totally different if I already had found another job. But this was a scenario where I determined that what I'm doing right now is not just unsustainable, but actively detrimental to my health. And I had a lot of friends and former colleagues tell me, like, just don't try so hard at work. Like, work's not that important. And, I could have potentially stuck it out longer at my workplace to, continue working on changing the way I worked, the hours I worked. But I'm someone who naturally wants to go all in on whatever I'm doing. And so for me, it made sense. Ultimately, I say this easily now, but Katie is acknowledging how difficult it was for me to make this decision. It ultimately made sense that I might actually be able to find that new opportunity faster if I quit first and allowed myself to fully focus on resting and then fully focusing on exploring my interests. But to talk more about the difficulties behind that, yeah, there was immense social pressure to not leave my current job. And if I was going to leave, it had either better be for, a top 5 MBA program or, for an even higher paying job. Like everyone had left my company, always made sure to kind of declare like, hey, I'm leaving for this better opportunity. And here I was saying to my also type A, high performing, high stress supervisors, I'm leaving and I don't have another job lined up. I'm leaving to focus on my health, physical and mental. And I don't think we've addressed this yet, but I am also Asian American. And so the optics for a young, high-performing Asian American woman to tell this huge corporation with a very established name and reputation to say, hey, I'm leaving without a job lined up. I had underestimated how much of a message that would say, because it was also saying, I hate this job so much, I would rather and continue to work. And that was definitely how that was taken when I first turned in my leave of notice. And there was so much social pressure because there was kind of less work that had to be reconciled on the other end if someone already had a higher paying job, right? Like if I went to them and said, actually, I have, another job offer, they're offering 25% more pay. Okay, their job's done, like we can't offer higher pay. That's not our policy. So, it's unfortunate. We're sorry to see you go. But here I was basically challenging the work environments that they had fostered. And I should also mention that because 30-year, 40-year work anniversaries were so common at this corporation, people would retire and just come back working out of retirement. There were many what we called annuitants who basically retired and then decided to come back for even higher pay. Because that culture of a lifelong career with this corporation was so common, people leaving was also treated with a lot of shame and secrecy. Whenever someone quit their job at my company, unless I knew them personally, I did not know, even if they were working in the same team, until one day I would try to send an email to them or try to instant message them and their account would have been deactivated. It was very weird to me when I learned from other friends or heard from other friends that their colleagues threw them like a farewell party or things like that. I was like, this company does not do that. If someone left this company, it was treated as a failure either on their part or on the company's part. And I think that's in part why there was so much pressure to prove that I was leaving for more prestige, because leaving was already considered a failure. And so obviously I was leaving for no job. And so it's quite difficult to mine prestige out of that at first blush. And so I really struggled with that. And I remember we had many conversations about like, who am I trying to impress? Like, whose opinion am I so worried about retaining? And it really just came down to, my coworkers. I'm afraid of what my coworkers and friends will think of me if I leave, because I thought maybe they'll think that I just wasn't disciplined enough to be able to make that time to find another job. Maybe they thought, oh, well, she never had what it actually took to make it in this. And both of those hurt me deeply, and who had still so much identity tied to my work performance.
And your work performance, by the way, was excellent, like by objective measures of the company, right? That's important to say.
That's important to say too. Yes, it was. We have a stacked or tiered performance ranking system at my company, and I had the highest performance ranking. And I had never been upset about my total compensation, but I had also consistently received pay raises equivalent to that of what a top performer would receive at this company. So yes, there was a huge disconnect in that the company was also paying me according to their standard rewards. They were also providing recognition in the form of that kind of performance ranking. They were giving me positive feedback. And, originally I hadn't even recognized that. I had built a totally different narrative of myself at work. And it wasn't until those first 6 months with you that I was even able to accept, compliments, or accept that someone wasn't just saying something, and that they that I was someone who was smart and competent, and great to work with. And so, yes, fortunately, I had already reached that opinion of myself by the time I turned in my leave of notice. But yes, in addition to being a young female engineer who was leaving because she couldn't stand the workplace anymore, this was also a high-performing Asian American female engineer who was leaving. And so, yeah, it was bad optics for the company. And I think it was in part why I received so much pushback, even from my initial leave of notice, where they were almost trying to convince me that I was the one who hadn't tried hard enough to stick out my job. Like, why didn't you tell us? Like, we would have wanted to accommodate you. We're always looking to change and try to improve how we're better serving our employees. And I was like, I did. I tried asking for support. I tried. And, it took, I remember this was one of those instances where it was like an emergency phone call or emergency voice memo exchange with you, because I had made the decision to leave, but that was one of those instances where my gut was leading and my brain was up. And so my gut knew it was the right time to leave, but my brain hadn't yet fully reconciled all of the reasons that I've just shared. And so when I first took my leave of notice, I remembered there was so much on the other end of trying to convince me that it was me that hadn't done enough to try to stay at this company. And that was something else I had to work through on top of all of the additional family and society pressure to not leave a well-paying job where I was recognized and compensated for it.
Yeah. I love how you describe this, because if somebody just talks to you now, your mind is so well managed on this. You're like, well, of course I left. Like, I'm somebody who gives it my all. And like, I just couldn't, even conceive of what I wanted next while I'm giving my all to this job. But like, it was, really tough for you. You had a lot of thoughts, you had a lot of doubts. And I know, because you came to our very beginning of our coaching engagement, like considering a new job and wanting to figure out what the next job would be, that you actually put in a lot of amazing work to get your hours down so that you could have mental space to try to think about your next job. And for many people, that's sufficient. But then this whole curveball of this really intense deliverable came, and it just became clear that some company cultures, even if you do all the work to get the hours down, which you did and did quite successfully, it's just, they're not going to let you do that. They're just going to then take over everything.
Right. It became clear that it was not just a me problem, it was a me and them problem. And it was no longer worth it for me to stay in that situation.
Yeah.
And so that was last year. And so since then, it came with the same turbulence of that first 6-week vacation I had taken, where I am remarkably consistent. And it took me again 4 weeks to stop running around with like a headless chicken and realize that, oh, I can accept the deep rest that I've just made this enormous opportunity for. And I am also kind of excited to talk about the additional self-coaching I've done as a result of all of the one-on-one coaching that we had done. So because Katie is so good at listening and asking the right questions, I had started to develop that same habit of being able to similarly self-coach myself and be like, well, why am I feeling this way? And what could I do to think about it from another angle?
And I'll give the context. I love that you're talking about this. The context is we finished working together in December and we're recording this in February. So we haven't been working together for like 2 months. And every time I email Olivia, she's like, I had all these new insights. And I'm like, okay, we got to get you on the podcast. You got to talk about it. So I want you to share them. Yeah.
No, it's like, learning to ride a bike for the first time. Like the whole time I was on training wheels. And then it's like, oh my God, Katie, like I'm riding my bike for the first time without them.
Right. You're self-coaching without me being there. You're having all these insights and able to work on your own thoughts and your own actions. Yeah.
Right. And so, after that initial turbulent month, 2 months, I would say, of like, is it okay for me to rest now that I'm actually unemployed? I was now starting to think about, what am I going to do next? And I knew that, or at least I thought that, okay, I still want to be employed in the future. I want to look for a new job that I'm interested and informed in and ready to start. I didn't have an illusion about a perfect job. I knew that every job would have its ups and downs, and I just wanted to be more informed and more researched. So that way I knew about the downs going in and chose to accept them. So that way I could better be present for the good in that job. And I spent a lot of time networking, but I found myself dragging my feet when it came to actually applying for jobs or making that hard request when I was networking. And whenever I'm dragging my feet, I've learned that it's always worthwhile questioning why, because I'm tired and therefore just need more rest. Is it because I'm scared and therefore I need to address some other fears that I might actually have that are seemingly indirect but actually related to this question? Or is it that I actually don't want to do this? And so in this case, what I found was that all of my time was spent dreaming about some big travel abroad plans. And this just felt so stereotypically millennial of me. And, I'm still constantly working on my need for feeling understood and validated. And so this was the big fear I had after leaving my job, where I was just really afraid of being considered this ideal, or not ideal, but this naive, privileged, entitled millennial that's just, going off on fleeting whims to be irresponsible and things like that. And so I kept shutting myself down. I was like, no, I cannot think about traveling abroad until I found my next new job. And this was not working. I kept wondering, I kept talking to more people, learning about their jobs, having a lot of informational interviews. And I'm like, nothing is really landing. And after a couple of months, so this was after our engagement ended in December, I finally thought, what if my next job isn't actually the end to my current means? Like, what if my next job is just a means to an end, so that way I can continue to have amazing adventures like the travel abroad plan that I'm having? And then more critically, I thought, what if booking these plans and just going ahead with booking these plans means that I actually find my next job faster? What if it actually helps my job search because I'm no longer spending all of my energy thinking and dreaming about these travel abroad plans? And I think
okay, first of all, can we just also say like what badass thought work that was to get yourself to the point where you're like, actually, what if the travel, which I'm so afraid of and makes me seem frivolous and all the things, is actually going to make it faster because I'm going to unblock myself and whatever, like to turn that around. We don't have to always believe that, it's not like that's an inherently positive thought, but that thought that you were able to get to that point for a thought that really served you better.
Right. And I think it's important to say that my answer wasn't immediately yes to those questions. It was, but just even being able to phrase that question and consider the question also allowed me to realize that there were more degrees of freedom in the way that I could choose to live or make decisions. And that in itself was extremely freeing because I was no longer making the decision from a place of shame. And so I did that. I spent 2 days very excitedly Googling and booking plans. And then literally the day after those 2 days of intensive travel planning, I got my first call back. And that was just a euphoric high. And it was also helpful to be able to place that euphoric high because I knew that from all the coaching we had done, that part of the reason why I was so excited was that I was just so relieved. Like, I was like, oh my God, someone actually wants me. I'm actually still desirable in a professional environment. Because I was so relieved, I was so euphoric about that callback and so excited that I was right about the self-coaching. But it also meant that I was prepared for the crash after that euphoric high because it was such disproportionate joy to what I was feeling when I got that first callback. I was prepared for the crash the next day and recovered from it pretty quickly because then that got to my second big question where I had moved on from, am I allowed to have fun even if I'm unemployed? To, am I allowed to be picky about jobs? And this last question, if you had asked me 5 years ago, I would have been like, no. Like when you're looking for jobs, you can't be picky. You need to cast a wide net. And, I think a lot of people might also feel that way as well. But then I threw in a twist where I was like, okay, maybe let's say hypothetically 95% of the people would say, no, don't be picky about jobs when you're unemployed. But then what if I said that job managed radioactive waste? I would be willing to bet that a significant percentage of the people who responded yes, who would say, no, don't be picky, would be like, well, not that job. And it's like, well, why? And this is not hypothetical, by the way. This is this is genuinely one of the offers that might be on my table. And the polarity is actually pretty funny. And because I could be manufacturing chocolate, or I could be working on software, or I could be managing radioactive waste. It's very Charlie and the Chocolate Factory.
Yeah.
But, just introducing the idea of like, well, nothing else has changed other than the type of job. Why should nuclear waste, which I think is just great in how exaggerated it feels, why should that be a deciding factor in whether it's okay to be picky or not about a job? And so, that was also something I've been sitting with. And it allowed me to be more collected and more reasonable about my expectations in terms of, okay, it's exciting to have someone reach back out, but I also want to make sure that I'm continuing to be deliberate and intentional about how I think about this job and what I ask about this job to make sure what I understand about it, or to clarify my understanding of this job. But those were the two biggest questions that I was sitting with. And then concurrently, underneath all of this, the reason why Katie was like, every time Olivia emails me, there's new updates, because those two questions about, is it okay to have fun? Is it okay to be picky while I'm unemployed by choice? I had also signed up for a creative writing workshop starting in January that was a middle of the night decision where I was like, look, I just need to book it. I was like, if it ends up not working out, I'll ditch the classes. It's fine. And it was like, I need to just book it now or I will never do it. And I had not planned for this to at all factor into any professional development or career exploration. It was just something fun to do that I'd always been thinking about. But because I was leaning into that momentum and allowed myself to be fully present during those creative writing classes, I realized that I like writing. I'm good at it. I'm good at writing under pressure. And I also realized that actually I was good at writing at my old job too. And it's an odd but powerful combination when you have an engineer who likes to write. And I realized that that was something that could work in my favor. And yet another example of my gut leading before my brain, I had booked on LinkedIn a technical writing job that initially I had dismissed because I still had many biases and was still holding on to the narrative of like, I am an engineer who is smart and competent. And this job didn't have the word engineer in its title. So I thought this is a step down originally when I came across it on LinkedIn. But I thought, I saved it still because obviously there was something compelling about it. And it wasn't until I signed up for that creative writing class that I realized, oh, this is something that I actually enjoy doing in a technical aspect too. And, not to romanticize the job search market because interviewing is also another process rife with rejection. But I thought, okay, I'll apply to this technical writing position. I don't know anyone at the company. I haven't been talking to anyone about a technical writing job. So I'll need to start rebuilding my network from the ground up. And I submitted my application Sunday night. The hiring manager emailed me Monday morning. I interviewed Tuesday afternoon, and I progressed the second round on Wednesday of this past week. And it was just amazing how many things and how quickly things started to fall into place once I started leaning into momentum and kind of allowed myself to be fully present with my current environment, what I was feeling, and the opportunities that I was now able to see as a result of that.
Yeah, I'm just basking in you. Yeah, I love it. I love your courage in, despite being like a really intelligent and cognitive person, letting your gut lead sometimes and sort of like catch up with it with the brain. And then you become so skillful at then mentally working on your thoughts when you notice that they're maybe not serving you and like you would sort of yearn in a different direction. And like, also just what a beautiful story that is of like booking the travel and then doing the creative writing workshop, sort of like, I'm not sure why I'm doing this, but I'm doing it. And for me, it also feels like there's a lot of threads that have been real for you for a long time. Like I remember in the dessert club, even you mentioning helping some friend with her writing project and that you like doing that. So to me, I'm like, well, of course you like writing, Olivia, but it's like now it like comes out more fully,
Right. I think I had really underestimated just how much more empowered I would be with more energy outside of work, because I was trained and conditioned to really map out, every single thing I would do in order to achieve a certain end goal. And as a result, I had always just been operating under the assumption that work deserves all of the energy. And through this work, I realized, oh, wow, like now that I have time, energy, and health, I'm realizing so many more opportunities that I previously wouldn't have been able to.
I love it. I'm so fired up listening to you. Okay. Oh my gosh, this is going to be such a long, juicy one. This is so good. Okay. So we should wrap up. So some concluding questions for you as we're arriving in the present. One of them would be, you've sort of described where you are on so many levels, so I won't make you summarize that, but like you started coaching feeling like we're just going to become good friends in our time together. What would you say is your ultimate experience of like what coaching was? Was it just us chatting and becoming friends? Like what happened?
I think the best way to concisely put what coaching was like for me was that it's sort of like the phenomenon where it's very easy to give a friend advice on their problem because you're third party to them. And you're able to see their situation more objectively than they are, because they have so many biases and narratives and beliefs about the way that they need to see a certain situation. Except in this case, I needed someone who was far more objective, removed, and trained to be able to really unpack all of the narratives, beliefs, and values that I thought were important to me, because I was trying to change parts of my life at a fundamental level that many of my family and friends would not have been able to recognize, or would not have been fully equipped to really help me through, because they had their own biases and beliefs to operate from. So it was like the best possible soundboard where, I get to be able to share what I was thinking and have my thought process kind of poked and prodded at to kind of challenge, well, why do you believe things a certain way? Do you really need to progress this certain action? Do you really need to react this way? Or do you really need to respond immediately? Or do you need to sit in your feelings for a bit? And I think it was extremely helpful, because I came into coaching, at least, I'll give at least some props to myself in knowing that I was coming into coaching hoping to develop more mental tools for basically, like, I have like a toolbox, and I was just missing some fundamental tools. And I think working with you and hearing the questions that you're asking me, working through the questions, and then learning to be able to ask myself those same questions was like adding tools to my toolbox. So that way I could leave with more confidence in the decisions I was making and be able to own any learnings from those decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. Building out the toolbox. Yeah. And I love what you said too about, like, even our most beloved family and friends, sometimes they have their own lenses, or like we're just on a path that they can't totally understand. So, and they haven't been on themselves. And so they can't quite advise us in the way that we need.
Right. And so I think that, like we were hinting at the beginning, this is potentially stuff that I could have learned, in another 10 years or so. Because when I look back on my high school self, there are whatever level of anxiety or burnout I was operating at when I came to you first, I was operating at a much higher level of anxiety in high school.
Yeah.
So I could probably project that in another 10 years, I might have reached this level of compassion and calmness and confidence. But I was able to achieve that on a more accelerated timeline by being all in on really exploring different questions about the way I thought with you.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that description too of coaching. It's like, and I love that because, yeah, you were not a person without inner resources and capabilities who could have done a lot of work on your own. It's just like, if you can have that rocket fuel that pushes you 10 years ahead, like what is available to you now, and what would you not waste your time doing? And like, can be very valuable.
Yeah, I can't even imagine if I stayed 10 more years at that company.
Oh my God. Okay. Okay, good. Okay, I have a wrap-up question, but one last question before we get to that, which is, sometimes people who are considering working with me name the fact that, like, sometimes I am a white woman and they are not white. They're a non-white person of color. I'm curious what your thoughts of that. I actually don't even know your answer would be. And like, what was it like for you? And did you find that to be challenging, or what was your experience like with that?
Yeah, that was something I was considering when I first started with you, because so much of the pressure that I was working to process was from immigrant parents. So I'm Asian American, and immigrant parents, I think on the whole, have a distinct set of expectations for their oldest child. And so coming in, I was initially not sure if I should approach the idea of like how I manage my relationship with my family with you. And so that's why I would say a significant portion of our time during our coaching engagement, I really focused on the professional in terms of what am I doing with my professional career? What do I want to do next for my professional life? What I've found is that I think a lot of the tools, if we're going back to the toolbox analogy, are universal. They don't necessarily have to be applied in exactly the ways that you suggest or recommend, but having those additional tools allows you to be able to kind of better adapt to your own family dynamics or your own cultural expectations. Because I would say that this again ties back to the analogy I had for the atom models, where, you know, I was already getting so much value out of what I was learning from you. And I can't necessarily draw a one-to-one relationship between, you know, this is what I did at work as a result of my work with Katie, and this is what I did with my family, you know, as a copy and paste. But because I find the learnings to be so universal, because I had reached a new sense of self-compassion, of self-confidence, of trust in my decisions, of being able to listen to my body, that actually went a huge way towards me figuring out my own cultural expectations and family dynamics as well. You know, this past holiday was challenging because I was coming back not as, you know, the golden child with the high paying salary at the huge corporation, but now as the unemployed by choice kid. And I realized that because I was much more compassionate and curious about the way I thought, that I was also able to more effectively adapt what we had learned to any specific context that I had at home.
Yeah.
And so I would say that your learnings or your teachings or your coaching practices and philosophies span cultures. And we did talk. There were times where we would talk about my relationship with my mom or my relationship with my dad. And even if at first blush I didn't necessarily agree, or I felt like something felt out of place, it's the same thing where sometimes just asking a question helps you figure out what the right next set of decisions or actions or beliefs to have about a certain situation are.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to say is basically it all applies.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I appreciate you answering honestly. And yeah, I haven't asked you that question before, so we didn't know what the answer was going to be. So I appreciate you answering honestly. I think it's something that's on people's minds too, and I think it's an important question.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so as we're finishing up, my last final question for you is just, what last thing do you want to share with the people listening? If it's like an insight that you had that you're like, the people need to know, or I don't know, like, what do you feel like you would like to share that would be helpful to people that you learned, or about how coaching is like, or anything else?
I think it's just that coaching is continuous, whether it's with a coach or by yourself. Because, you know, I was really excited to tell you about the things that I had applied after we ended coaching, formal coaching together. And, you know, it's now exciting for me to see, oh, okay, here's how I dealt with a similar situation in the past. Here's how I dealt with similar anxieties in the past. How could I apply that now to my current trigger or anxiety inducing situation? You know, something I'm always grappling with is my fear of falling behind. We talked a lot about that. I remember 2 months into coaching, I was like, Katie, what if I'm just falling behind? Like, why haven't I already found a new job? And that was always my need for validation, speaking up, just coming back in different disguises and forms. And it was exciting not exciting. It was not exciting to feel that same fear again 2 months after I left my job, but it was exciting to see how I was able to respond to that and see that this is a continuous path of growing and learning. And again, just really building out that toolbox to be able to meet new problems and challenges.
I love it. Thank you so much, Olivia, for your time and for being so generous with your insights.
You spent almost 2 hours with me, so thank you.
If you really want to change in a meaningful, lasting way, that's when you need a life coach. Every client I've worked with has had incredibly personalized reasons why they're in the tired or anxious or stuck or uninspired state they're in. Working with me can help you identify those roadblocks, which are usually blind spots that you genuinely cannot see, and implement a profoundly customized, doable plan for overcoming them. I have a very small, high-end, one-on-one coaching practice. If you'd like to be my next client, reach out at katiesiever.com. I'd love to meet you.